the moment the Coast Guard cutter breached the harbor, its distress horn screaming across the fog. Mercy General Hospital's loading dock went completely still. Not because of the horn, because the radio crackle coming through the dock supervisor's walkie-talkie carried a name nobody in this building had said in 4 years. Where is Ironside? Cora Hutchins moved the way she always moved through the corridors of Mercy General. Carefully, deliberately, one shoulder slightly lower than the other to compensate for the weight she carried in her right hip. The injury was old, the kind that had been badly set in a field hospital in a country most Americans couldn't find on a map, and it had never healed quite right. The result was a subtle but unmistakable hitch in her stride, a half pause between steps that the nursing staff had quietly nicknamed the Hutchins Shuffle, in a way they thought she couldn't hear. She heard it. She heard most things people assumed she couldn't. Cora was 36, though the gray threading through her dark hair at the temples made some of the younger residents peg her closer to 45. She kept it pulled back in a low bun so tight it looked almost punishing. She wore no makeup. She carried no phone. Her badge identified her as Hutchins C., patient services coordinator, and her primary function at Mercy General was filing insurance paperwork, managing bed allocation spreadsheets, and occasionally escorting confused elderly patients from radiology back to their rooms. She was, to put it plainly, furniture, the kind of furniture that everyone steps around without thinking about why it's there. Dr. Philip Drummond had made this observation out loud, once, to a cluster of surgical residents gathered around the coffee station on the 4th floor. He hadn't lowered his voice. Cora had been standing 8 feet away, her back turned, refiling a stack of discharge summaries into the wrong slot. On purpose, because she'd learned that looking occupied made people forget you were listening. That woman, Drummond had said, stirring his coffee with the cap of his pen, is the single greatest waste of a hospital ID badge I have ever witnessed. She moves like a damaged clock. She files paperwork. She escorts Alzheimer's patients who don't know what day it is. He paused for effect, which, come to think of it, is probably the right cognitive level for her. The residents had laughed. Not all of them, but enough. Drummond was Mercy General's chief of emergency medicine. He was brilliant, fast-handed, and constitutionally incapable of being wrong in front of an audience. He had been recruited from Johns Hopkins at 38, had published 4 papers in the last 2 years alone, and spoke about his own credentials the way some men spoke about their children. With a love that bordered on obsession, he had decided, sometime in Cora's 2nd month at Mercy General, that she was to be ignored. Not unkindly ignored, just efficiently ignored, the way you ignore a piece of medical equipment that belongs to a different department. Cora had let him. It was easier that way. The Tuesday in question began like most Tuesdays at Mercy General, with Drummond's voice. Hutchins. He didn't look up from the chart he was annotating when he said it. She was passing the nurse's station at the far end of the trauma hall. The bed allocation report for Thursday is wrong. Every single number in column 4 is off by 1. Fix it before noon or I'll have administration pull your access privileges. Cora stopped walking. She turned. His back was still to her. The numbers in column 4, she said, are correct. The discrepancy is in the source data from the overnight admissions log. Someone transposed a digit in the system at 2 in the morning. I flagged it to IT at 6:45. They're correcting the source. The column will reconcile automatically by 10. Drummond finally turned to look at her. The expression on his face was the one he reserved for particularly dense medical students. Then why, he said very slowly, does my printout show the wrong numbers? Because you printed it at 6:15, before the flag. A long pause. Then you should have reprinted it and left it on my desk, he said, turning back to his chart. That is literally what you are here to do. Cora said nothing. She turned and continued down the hall, her right hip hitching with every other step. At the nurse's station, Charge Nurse Deborah Finch watched this exchange with the expression of someone who had watched it in various forms approximately 300 times. She caught Cora's eye as she passed. One day, Deborah said quietly, "That man is going to say something he can't walk back." Cora picked up a stack of folders and tucked them under her arm. "He says things he can't walk back every single day," she said. "He just hasn't met the consequences yet." She said it without bitterness, without heat, the way you state a weather forecast. By 11 that morning, Mercy General's emergency department was running at 110% capacity. A charter fishing boat had capsized in rough water 12 miles offshore. Overcrowded, underpowered, caught sideways in a squall that had materialized in under 2 hours. 23 passengers. The Coast Guard had pulled 17 of them out of the water. The remaining 6 were still unaccounted for when the first ambulances started arriving. The trauma bays filled fast. Hypothermia cases, near drownings, 2 suspected spinal injuries, 1 confirmed cardiac arrest in the ambulance bay. Drummond was in his element, barking, directing, moving between bays, with the clipped efficiency of a man who genuinely loved this part of his job. Whatever his other qualities, he was fast and he was technically precise, and when the blood was running, he became almost tolerable. Almost. "Hutchins, get out of trauma hall." Drummond's voice cut across the chaos without breaking stride. "This is a live MCI. I cannot have non-essential personnel cluttering my sightlines." Cora had appeared at the edge of Bay 2, where a teenage boy, maybe 16, was seizing on the gurney while 2 residents fumbled over each other trying to get IV access. She had a full trauma kit in her hands. Not the standard hospital issue kit from the supply cabinet. Her own kit, which she kept in a locked box in the patient services office, and which contained, among other things, a laryngoscope, a needle decompression setup, a compression tourniquet rated to arterial pressure, and 2 units of hemostatic gauze that had no business being in a patient coordinator's possession. She set the kit down on the supply table by Bay 2. "He's been seizing for 90 seconds, she said. "His core temp is 34.1. You need to pull back on the diazepam. You're going to drop his respiratory drive. He needs active rewarming, a nasopharyngeal airway to protect him until the seizing stops. And if he doesn't break in the next 45 seconds, you'll want ketamine for refractory status." Both residents went still. Drummond crossed the floor in 4 steps. His voice, when it arrived, was very quiet. "Who told you to open that kit? Who told you to enter my trauma bay? Who told you?" He leaned closer, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath. "To give a medication recommendation in my emergency department." The boy on the gurney made a sound, a wet, choked sound. Cora didn't look away from Drummond. "His oxygen sat just dropped to 81, she said. Drummond turned. He looked at the monitor, his jaw tightened. Then he turned back to Cora and pointed at the door. "Get out of my bay," he said. "Security, somebody get her out of my bay and keep her out." Cora let them walk her out. She didn't fight it. She stood in the hallway outside Bay 2 and listened to the monitor alarm cycle twice more before Drummond gave the ketamine order, the right call 3 minutes later than it should have been. The boy stabilized. Cora picked up her kit from the supply table where nobody had touched it, and walked back toward patient services. She was halfway down the corridor, her hip hitching with every other step, when the harbor alarm began. Not a fire alarm, not a trauma pager. The harbor alarm was a different sound entirely. A low, resonant frequency that Mercy General's coastal location had required them to install as a secondary alert system for maritime mass casualties. It had been tested twice in the 7 years since installation. It had never actually sounded. It sounded now. And underneath it, bleeding through the dock supervisor's radio at the service entrance below, came the voice of a Coast Guard communications officer reading a patient manifest that made 3 different nurses stop walking simultaneously. Cora heard it from the stairwell. She stopped. She pressed her hand flat against the cinder block wall, not for balance, but out of habit. The way she used to press herself against walls in narrow corridors, when the air outside smelled like smoke, and the radio was telling her something she didn't want to confirm. She listened. The words were half static, half clear, but she caught enough. Coast Guard cutter Reliance, requesting immediate surgical readiness, multiple GSW casualties inbound. Classified transport was aboard vessel, requesting personnel verification. Does your facility have clearance for priority medical? We are looking for the practitioner listed under call sign. The signal broke up. Then, Ironside. We need Ironside. Cora's hand came off the wall. She stood completely still for 4 seconds. Her right hip ached the way it always ached when she stood still too long. A deep, grinding pressure that had been her constant companion since the morning an ambush in a mountain pass had turned a routine medical convoy into something that took her 3 years to stop dreaming about. Then she walked, not limped, walked, to the nearest supply closet on the floor, unlocked it with her master key, and pulled out the second kit. The one she kept sealed in a waterproof case at the back of the highest shelf, behind the spare IV pole bags. She had a third one in her car. She hoped she wouldn't need it. The Coast Guard cutter came into the dock at 12:14. What came off it was not what Mercy General had been briefed for. The first 6 gurneys were the expected maritime casualties: hypothermia, lacerations, 1 documented near drowning, now breathing but unconscious. Standard MCI procedure. Drummond was in the ambulance bay calling assignments, his voice sharp and controlled. Then the last section of the cutter's deck became visible, and the atmosphere on the dock changed. 4 figures in tactical gear materialized from the hold. Not Coast Guard, not civilian maritime rescue. They were moving with a flat, specific efficiency that had nothing to do with disaster response and everything to do with controlled extraction. The way people move when the threat is ongoing, and they've already accepted that as a condition of work. Between them, on a reinforced field litter, was a man who should not have been alive. He was wearing the remnants of a dry suit over what appeared to be a military medical vest, the kind with integrated tourniquet slots and a chest seal pre-applied on the left side. His face was the color of old concrete. His left arm ended at mid-forearm, a clean traumatic amputation, wrapped in a bright orange hemostatic dressing that had been applied with precise economical pressure. An IV line ran into his right arm, connected to a bag carried by one of the tactical personnel. His breathing was audible from 15 feet away, wet, labored, the specific sound of fluid in a chest cavity that hadn't been fully cleared. Behind the litter, moving fast enough that the dock personnel had to step aside, came a woman. She was wearing civilian clothes, dark pants, a gray pullover, but she moved like someone who had forgotten how to be a civilian and had stopped trying to remember. She was speaking rapidly into an satellite phone with one hand and holding a medical clipboard against her chest with the other, and her eyes were already moving across the hospital entrance with the automatic, systematic scan of someone cataloging threats and resources simultaneously. She was Chief Petty Officer Renata. No. She was introduced by one of the tactical personnel as Dr. Alderman. But the way the uniformed men deferred to her suggested that title was not the whole story. She hit the automatic doors at a pace that suggested she'd intended to go through them whether they opened or not. And she nearly collided with Drummond, who was stepping out. Drummond drew himself up. His authority voice arrived immediately. "This is a restricted medical bay. You do not bring armed personnel into who authorized this transport to this facility. I need a chain of custody document and a patient manifest before anyone." Dr. Alderman looked at him. It was a very brief look, the kind of look that doesn't involve assessment because assessment is already complete. "We didn't come here for you," she said, and walked past him. Drummond turned. His face was a shade of red that Cora, watching from the interior hallway, had not seen before. "You do not walk away from me," Drummond said, following. "I am the chief of emergency medicine at this hospital. I have surgical authority over every patient who enters through those doors, and I need to know who is in charge of this transport." The tallest of the tactical personnel, a man with a name tape that read Garvey, stopped walking just long enough to turn and face Drummond directly. "She is," Garvey said. Then he kept walking. Drummond stood in the middle of his own ambulance bay, flanked by his residents, watching a woman he had never met commandeer his trauma hall. "Stand by," Dr. Alderman said, not to Drummond, to nobody in particular, or to the room as a whole. She had stopped at the entrance to Trauma Bay 1, looking at the patient on the litter, then at the available equipment, and her face did something complicated. "I need a vascular surgeon," she said. "I need a thoracic setup. And I need whoever does your hyperbaric coordination." Deborah Finch, charge nurse and the only person in the building who had never once been visibly rattled by anything, stepped forward. "We can get you thoracic in 12 minutes, Deborah said. "Hyperbaric coordination goes through the 3rd floor. Vascular. We have Dr. Ellison on call, but he's 40 minutes out." Dr. Alderman's expression didn't change, but her eyes moved. They moved directly to Cora. Cora was standing at the edge of the bay entrance, her kit in hand, her right hip making its quiet protests. She had not announced herself. She had not moved forward. She was simply there, the way she was always simply there. Part of the institutional furniture, easy to see through. Dr. Alderman, however, did not see through her. She looked at Cora the way people look at something they've been searching for and had begun to fear they wouldn't find. "Hutchins," she said. Not a question. Cora looked at her. Dr. Alderman turned to Garvey. "That's her," she said. "That's Ironside." The silence that followed was the kind that makes people aware of their own breathing. Deborah Finch's pen stopped moving. 2 residents exchanged a look they didn't know how to translate. And Dr. Philip Drummond, Chief of Emergency Medicine, 6 publications in the last 30 months, recruited from Johns Hopkins at the peak of his career. Dr. Drummond looked at the woman he had been dismissing for 4 years and said, without thinking, very loudly, "Her?" The contempt in his voice was total and involuntary. The way contempt is when it's been rehearsed so long it becomes reflex. Cora set her kit down on the supply table. She did not look at Drummond. She looked at the man on the litter. She looked at the chest seal, at the way his breathing moved wrong on the left side, at the color of his face, at the tourniquet on the amputation site, at the saline bag running through a line that was positioned slightly wrong for his body weight. She walked to the litter. The tactical personnel stepped aside without being asked. "What's his name?" she said. "Hartley," Dr. Alderman said. "Commander Hartley. He was in the water for 14 minutes before extraction." "What was the water temperature?" 51 degrees. We have a core temp of 32.8 on pullout, trending up now to 34.2. "The chest seal. Is there a tension component or incomplete drainage?" "Incomplete. We needled him on the boat, right side only. Left side has a hemothorax we couldn't safely drain at sea." Cora's hands were already moving. She had the seal checked and repositioned before Alderman finished the sentence. "He needs a thoracostomy on the left," Cora said, "and his pressure line is in the wrong position for his cardiac output. At this temp, his heart is going to be irritable, and I need to be able to push fluids with more control than this setup gives me." She looked up. "Deborah, I need a left side chest tube setup, warm saline at 42 degrees, a cardiac crash cart inside this bay, and if there's any chance that vascular surgeon can get here faster than 40 minutes, I want someone working that problem right now." Deborah was already moving. Drummond stepped forward. His voice had gotten quieter, which was somehow worse than when he shouted. "Jenkins, Hutchins, you do not have surgical privileges in this department. You are a patient coordinator. Whatever this woman thinks you are, whatever this situation is, you are not authorized to perform a thoracostomy in my emergency bay. I will have your badge and I will have you escorted from this building if you touch that man with anything other than a—" "Her name," Garvey said, from the doorway, "is Lieutenant Commander Cora Hutchins, United States Navy. Retired. She served 8 years with the Fleet Surgical Team, including 30 months attached to special operations. She has performed successful field thoracostomies in a moving vehicle, a collapsing building, and a helicopter flying below radar altitude." He said it the way you read a resume out loud to someone who needs to understand they're in the wrong room. Then he nodded once at Cora. "She's the reason Commander Hartley is breathing right now," he said. "She trained the medic who kept him alive on the boat for 4 hours. We tracked her here because she's the only person within 800 miles we trust to finish this." Drummond's mouth opened, then closed. "She has a hip injury," he said. His voice had lost something. He's saying something that suddenly doesn't quite fit in his mouth. "She can barely walk." Cora looked at him then, fully, directly, without performing anything. "The hip," she said, "is not what I operate with." She turned back to Hartley. The next 47 minutes were very quiet. Drummond did not leave the bay. He also did not speak. He stood at the glass panel beside the door in a posture that Cora recognized. Not because she'd seen him in it before, but because she'd seen it before on other faces, in other rooms. The particular stillness of a very capable person watching someone better than them work. She had seen that look on a forward operating base surgeon's face 8 years ago, when she'd performed an emergency burr hole on a Marine who'd been told by everyone present that he had 7 minutes. She'd had 12. She'd used 10. Hartley was harder. The hemothorax was larger than Alderman had estimated. Close to 800 milliliters of blood that had to be drained carefully, not evacuated fast, because his core temp made rapid fluid shifts dangerous. His heart, as predicted, showed runs of atrial fibrillation from the hypothermia. She managed them with medication adjustments and position, without shocking him, because at his temperature an electrical shock to the heart carried risks she was not willing to accept. The amputation site was clean. Whoever had managed it on the boat knew their work. She reinforced the dressing, confirmed there was no secondary vascular compromise at the elbow, and left it for the vascular surgeon to evaluate properly. The chest tube went in while Hartley was barely conscious. He squeezed her wrist once when she explained what she was doing. She took that as consent and gratitude simultaneously and told him he was going to be fine, in the same flat, steady voice she'd used to say it in places where she was considerably less certain. At some point during the chest tube placement, she became aware that her right hip was causing her significant pain. The position she was holding, braced against the side of the gurney, weight shifted to compensate for her injury, was not sustainable, and her body was registering its opinion loudly. She did not change position. Not today, she thought. And it was not the first time she had thought exactly that, in exactly those words, in exactly this kind of room. The monitor, which had been alarming intermittently for the first 20 minutes, steadied. The atrial fib resolved. Hartley's color began the slow, incremental return to something that resembled living. When Deborah told her that Dr. Ellison had arrived and was scrubbing, Cora completed the dressing she was placing, tied it, checked it once, and stepped back from the table. Garvey was watching from the doorway. He had not moved from that position once. "He's stable," Cora said. Garvey exhaled, a long, controlled breath that told her exactly how long he'd been holding it. Dr. Alderman appeared at her elbow. "We have transport arranged to Portsmouth Naval Medical for definitive care." "But Hutchins," she paused, "we have a situation we need to talk about." Cora stripped off her gloves and dropped them in the biohazard bin. "We can talk in the hallway," she said. The hallway was not empty. Drummond was there. Deborah was there. 3 residents, 2 of whom were still wearing expressions that suggested their entire understanding of certain things had been recently restructured. Dr. Alderman looked at Cora with the directness of someone who was not accustomed to asking twice. "I'll be honest with you," she said. "I'm not here just to say thank you, although—" She glanced back at Bay 1. "This is not something we will forget. I'm here because we have a gap. Our forward medical unit lost 3 senior personnel in the same incident that took Hartley off the board. We have a readiness problem that is going to become a visibility problem in about 9 weeks." She looked at Cora steadily. "We need someone with your specific background. Surgical tempo in constrained environments, cold water operations, the particular kind of judgment that does not come from textbooks." Cora looked at the floor, at the linoleum, which was the same shade of institutional gray it had been for 4 years. She thought about the bed allocation spreadsheets, about the insurance forms, about the filing system she had reorganized 3 times because Drummond kept approving changes and then forgetting he'd approved them. She thought about a teenager seizing on a gurney and a medication recommendation delivered too late. She thought about a monitor alarm cycling twice before someone listened. "I left for a reason," she said. "I know," Alderman said. "I read your file, all of it, not just the official version." A pause. "The reason you left," Alderman said carefully, "is also the reason you're exactly what we need. You know what it costs. You do it anyway." Cora was quiet for a moment. From Bay 1, she could hear the steady rhythm of Commander Hartley's heart monitor. Slow, regular, increasingly confident. The sound of a system that had been brought back from the edge and stabilized by someone who knew which edges mattered. She reached into the pocket of her scrubs and pulled out her Mercy General ID badge. She looked at it. At Hutchins, C, Patient Reviews Coordinator, and at the small, slightly unflattering photo that had been taken on a day when she hadn't slept in 31 hours and hadn't bothered to fix her hair. She held it for a moment. Then she walked to the nurse's station and set it down on the counter in front of Deborah. Deborah looked at the badge, then at Cora. Cora said, "If someone reprints the column 4 report, the numbers will be correct now." Deborah looked at her for a long second. "Go," Deborah said quietly. "Just go." Cora turned. Drummond was still in the hallway. He was looking at her with an expression she didn't have a name for. Not quite remorse, not quite understanding, somewhere in the approach path to both. She stopped in front of him. He opened his mouth. She waited. He closed it again. Then he did something she had not expected. He stepped aside, not far, just enough. The way you step aside for someone you have, finally belatedly, recognized as having the right of way. Cora walked past him. Her right hip hitched on every other step, the way it always had, the way it always would. The sound of it, that small, irregular weight shift, moved down the corridor ahead of her. And this time, the staff in the hallway didn't look away from it, the way they usually did when they were pretending not to notice. This time, they watched her walk. At the end of the corridor, Dr. Alderman fell into step beside her. Garvey was already at the exterior door, holding it open against the gray harbor wind. Outside, the Coast Guard cutter was still docked. The water was still cold and still and indifferent to everything that had happened on its surface that morning. Cora Hutchins stepped through the door. The wind hit her face, salt-sharp and clean, and for the first time in 4 years, she didn't feel like furniture. She felt like what she had always been. She just hadn't been in the right room.